there's certainly a lot of trade barriers that make doing business across borders in Africa difficult for African multinationals. You have both tariff and non-tariff barriers. And in many instances, the challenge is not even the tariff barriers. It tends to be the non-tariff barriers. There's a lot of rent-seeking behavior in many African borders. And matches within the various sub-regional trading blocks like ECOWAS, like SADC, like EAC. You have governments that have essentially built, model free trade, areas. You still encounter the challenges. So the question, of course, is there's the fact that if you sign a free trade area agreement and governments start implementing it, does that necessarily remove all the barriers to trade for African companies? Not necessarily. So we still have a long way to go with this process. We know that a lot of African multinational companies have been able to successfully expand across the continent, and they're trading across the continent despite these trading barriers. So we're optimistic that if we can bring down the trading barriers, we may not be able to eliminate them completely, but if we can bring them down progressively over time, our businesses will continue to succeed even better. The aspiration for us is not just the current African multinationals. It is also a deep reservoir of highly capable and highly innovative small local companies, local SMEs and local champions that are in all African countries that have, quite frankly, sufficient capabilities to move beyond their local borders and expand into the rest of the continent. It is these companies that we need to think about. And the way that the CFTA is being designed pays attention to a lot of these small business concerns. We're optimistic that if our government will proceed with the process, with the signing today and subsequent segments of the process, we can remove a lot of the barriers, and we can help our local companies to begin to move more and trade more across the rest of the continent.
Thank you very much. Now, what are the most challenging barriers that you think need to be urgently removed in this agreement?
Well, the agreement looks at trading goods and services and the free movement of people. And often when we think about free trade area agreements, we tend to think more about goods. But in fact, the free movement of people is a very, very critical pillar in this process, So it is as equally important. I would argue that it's even probably more important, because if you have free movement of goods, but you don't have free movement of people, you need people to move beyond borders to do the trading, to do the investing. And so the free movement of people is a critical challenge. I know there's a lot of emphasis on the free movement of goods and bringing the tariffs down. The other thing we need to do well is to move quickly on the African passport project that the African Union has been working on over the last 2 years. We need to move rapidly on that process and facilitate the process of issuing an African passport for all African citizens, which will guarantee visa-free entry into any African country for African citizens. This is going to be an important, critical pillar of the CFTA process. We need people moving. Trade starts with people moving. People move, then companies move, then capital moves, then products and goods move. So that is not talked about quite often. And that's one that I want to emphasize on, because it is very easy to place a lot of emphasis on negotiating the tariff and non-tariff agreements, but we also need to move quickly on the protocol for the movement of people. Yeah. Now,
do African multinational companies work in an environment friendly enough to help them compete with their foreign counterparts?
The environment is not necessarily the most conducive. If you look at the World Bank's ease of doing business reports that are released every year, the operating environment within Africa is not necessarily the best. And so it remains a challenge. They have to compete with competitors from other parts of the world who come into Africa with a lot of deep capital and deep technology capabilities and sometimes global brands. That makes it a lot easier for them to move much quicker. The advantage that African companies and African multinationals have had, some of it has to do with the fact that they have native insights. They understand the local terrain much better. They are more agile. They are able to adapt quicker to local realities, whereas a lot of the foreign players tend to be more rigid in their approach to Africa. So that has been the advantage that a lot of the African players have had. But you can't continue to compete perpetually on local and cultural advantages. At some point, foreign players are able to learn quick enough, and that unique advantage that African companies gain from their better understanding of the local terrain is neutralized. So we cannot continue to rely on that perpetually. In fact, we need our companies not just to succeed against global competitors in Africa. We also need our companies to succeed against global competitors in the rest of the globe. So one of the things we've done at the Afrochampions Initiative is to initiate the African Globalizers Program. And it is an initiative that is tracking the global expansion and global ambitions of African companies. We launched the African Globalizers Report in December 2017 in Johannesburg, South Africa. And it is a report that looks at 30 African companies and their global footprint and their global expansion ambitions. The lessons are clear that they are African companies that are clearly very ambitious globally. So we need to replicate many of these success models, but our governments need to do a lot more, because if our companies do not succeed first and foremost in the continent, it is going to be difficult for them to succeed in other parts of the world. They need to establish the home advantage within Africa and build on that home advantage to compete globally and win on the global stage. So, yes, it is tough for African companies and African multinationals, but I think we've seen a lot of success stories. Some foreign multinationals have come in and packed out. The African companies are giving them a run for their money. So they're great success stories, but our governments need to do more so our companies can succeed.